Excuse me. Excuse me. Sir? What's going on there? Why are you on my stuff? How many times have I told you not to be on my stuff? You need to get down. Excuse me. Excuse me, sir. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I make videos about health and fitness and all of those things, endurance sports. So if that's something that you're into, maybe you'll scroll on down there and consider, contemplate, ponder your willingness to hit any or all of those beautifully placed buttons there for your enjoyment and amusement. But today's video, we're going to be talking about Zwift racing. Now I've done a couple of videos in the past about Zwift racing, giving some actionable tips or strategies in terms of racing so that you can help to level up or maximize on your capacity as a Zwift racer. But what I haven't really talked about is how to get into racing for the first time. I know a number of you might be brand new to Zwift. You might be brand new to cycling in general. And some of you are coming to the platform from a road racing background and realizing that Zwift is just a completely different animal. And you might feel like you're in over your head. This is just a completely different world with completely different physics. And you're trying to get into racing, but you don't want to deal with the imposter syndrome, you don't want to be overwhelmed, and there's nothing more frustrating than jumping into a race that you think you're ready for, and then within about 10-15 seconds being completely shelled off the back because you are fundamentally unprepared for what's at stake in terms of Zwift racing. So in this video, I want to give you 5 practical tips that you can use to kind of increase your confidence and your competence when it comes to racing. This isn't so much in terms of strategy and tactics, but more of just mental and physical preparedness when it comes to getting into racing and doing so comfortably, right? That's the biggest thing about racing, is it's supposed to be fun. You know, there's no money on the line here. There's really not many points on the line here unless you're in some kind of sanctioned events. Most of these races we just do for fun, and if it's not fun, we're not going to do it. So hopefully you can use these 5 tips to make it more fun and feel more confident while you're doing it. These are just my opinion. These are things that I think would be helpful. These aren't hard and fast rules. This is just stuff that I've thought about that might help people who are newer to Zwift really get comfortable and get into racing. Now the first thing I'm going to recommend is actually a little bit counterintuitive, and that is going to be to join group events. Now I'm not talking about group rides with like a prescribed output or a beacon. I'm talking about specific events that come from like the campaigns like Tour de Zwift, Tour of Watopia, Fondos, or some of the branded events that are out there, and they're structured a little bit differently. So you are taking a category based on a distance or a profile of a ride rather than your ability. And then what happens is every man or woman for themselves, and people generally self-select in terms of smaller groups out on the road, and it's basically just you against the clock, and you're just looking to ride, and everybody's there for a different purpose. Some people are riding casually, some people are riding more competitively. Now you're going to find a faction of riders that basically ride these group events sort of like a race, and it happens at all skill levels. If you go and you race a group ride in one of those events, you'll find a group of like-abled and like-minded athletes out there that you can kind of test your mettle against for a mini race within a group ride. So what you'll find is that you'll have a group of people working hard. You'll find a lot of the dynamics of racing where maybe the riders aren't attacking one another, but there's other subgroups up the road that you're going to be surging or trying to bridge up to. So a lot of the power dynamics are going to be similar to what you might find in terms of an attack, right? You might want to try to close one of those gaps so that you can further your positioning in the entire group event. A lot of times these group events are a great place to kind of see where you stack up against a large population of riders. Maybe your goal is to get in the top 50%, 25%, 10%, whatever that goal might be. If you ride it like a race, you'll be able to kind of practice some of those dynamics. And if you're going to finish with a group of riders, I can tell you that there will invariably be a sprint. At least some people in your group are going to sprint for the finish. So you're going to be able to practice a lot of those dynamics and tactics that you see in racing, but you're not going to have the stress and pressure of actually being in a race. You're just practicing in a group event. And the other benefit is that if you do get dropped from the group that you're working with, you can just kind of reset, because if you drop back a little bit, there's going to be another group ready to scoop you up so you can try all over again. So it's really a great opportunity to practice some of those race dynamics and skills without the pressure of being in a race. Now the second thing, on the note of riding in group rides, whether it's in a group ride with a set pace, a group event, maybe you're riding with a meetup, maybe you're finding just a group of people randomly on the roads, or maybe a pace partner, I want you to practice the drafting. There is a lot of nuance when it comes to drafting on Zwift, and this is what catches out a lot of experienced riders. Even the best pros have come on this platform and been kind of embarrassed in things like races because they don't understand how the algorithm works and how the drafting works, and they get completely caught out because they're not moderating their effort appropriately. So if you're practicing drafting and you're observing how your avatar in the group responds to different dynamics and really studying that, paying attention to what's going on this right-hand side of the screen here and seeing how the power output is, you're going to want to pay attention to your power output in watts per kilogram versus everybody else. This is especially important for smaller riders. You might find that the group is traveling at 2.5 watts per kilogram, but you have to hold 2.8. That'll help you to be prepared for what type of comparative output you're going to have to deal with, and that carries into racing as well. It's a completely scalable model. So as you learn how your power stacks up in a group of other people going the same speed, you can mentally and physically prepared for what you might find in a race. The other thing you want to note in terms of drafting is how the blob works, right? The blob is the big amorphous group of riders that's a little unorganized. And when they're all bunched up, you get the greatest benefit, right? They're moving the fastest, you have a lot more riders to depend upon, and you might be tucked right in the middle of this big blob of riders. And any little gaps that show up are filled in rather quickly. But what happens is when the pace is a lot higher and the group stretches out a little bit more, sometimes these little gaps start to open up. And it can become very dangerous because of something called the sticky draft. And I'm going to leave an article down below by Eric Schlange that goes into more detail into how this works. But the Cliff's Notes version is that the algorithm, it's not so much a glitch as it is just kind of the way that it is it wants to glue you to the rider in front of you. It wants to give you that benefit of the draft, but it does so in a manner that might be a little bit aggressive. So even if you're putting out more relative power and you should be going faster than the rider in front of you, sometimes it doesn't allow you to overtake that rider. So you have to put out a large amount of power to break yourself out of that sticky draft. And this is especially important when that person in front of you might be letting a small gap open in front of them. Maybe they can't hold the power, or maybe they've lost focus. When the group is all strung out, those gaps don't naturally fill in with the algorithm. Somebody actually has to close that, and a bike length can turn into 10 bike lengths in literally 2 to 3 seconds. So being aware of that sticky draft and making sure that you're kind of focused on your positioning, especially when the group is strung out, or realizing when that gap is starting to form that you need to get on the power right away and close it. This is all stuff that comes with practice. You can have some intellectual heuristics when it comes to how the draft operates, but it really is going to come with you riding in a group a lot, observing how your avatar responds, observing what type of effort that you need at different speeds, looking at what different sizes of groups are doing, again, paying attention to what's going on the right-hand side of the screen and the riders around you, and looking out for trends. Maybe play around a little bit, see what happens if you get out of the saddle and do a short little effort, see how you move through the group, and see how you kind of flush through in what we call the washing machine effect. Drafting is extremely important in racing, and you really should practice it. Unless you're doing time trials or hill climb events, drafting is going to make or break your race. So the more that you can practice it outside of a race scenario, the more comfortable you're going to be managing it when you're inside of a race. The third thing I would recommend is to give some real thought to what your profile or strengths are as a rider. Now, you don't have to be exceptionally experienced here. You don't have to know your power profile inside and out to know this. You probably already have a sense for it. Whether you have a history in athletics or you've been riding for several weeks or several months, you probably realize that you tend to a certain type of riding. Maybe you are a real punchy rider and you like to kind of keep it nice and steady and easy, and then you want to get out of the saddle and you want to put in a real hard effort and you put those big digs in, and you're a sprinter and you're born for those big tough efforts, right? For that type of rider, it's probably going to be best that you look for those flat races, those criterium races, which lend themselves more to those strengths, right? So you want to pick something that suits you. Or maybe you are good at keeping a decent level of power, maybe a high percentage of your FTP, you've got that big diesel engine, and you can hold on to a nice long sustained effort, but you really don't like those punchy efforts. If you have to surge, you usually get dropped. You don't like those huge ebbs and flows in power. Well, maybe more of a climbing route is more your style. That way you can just kind of lock into a good watts per kilogram for your category, and you can go up the climb, and you're pretty much not going to have to worry too much about the draft. It's just you against the terrain. Or maybe you're a good all-rounder. You can do some decent sustained efforts. You're pretty decent at surging, but you're not a great sprinter, so you don't want to go to the end of the race with a big group of people because you're probably not going to perform very well when it comes to the final sprint. Maybe you want to look for a more variable course, more rolling course, with maybe some shorter climbs where you can make that selection, where maybe you can drop some of those more punchy riders at the base of the climb. you get up and over, and then when you approach the end of the race, you might be with a smaller, more selective group of people who might have a similar profile to you. You really need to evaluate what your strengths and weaknesses are and pick the right races for you. I'm a huge proponent of working your weaknesses and working your opportunities, but races are not the time to do that. You want to do that in your workouts, you want to do that in your free rides, but you should be racing to your strengths. We're there to compete, right? You want to get the best result possible? Well, the best result is going to come from you working within your strengths. So pick a race that suits you, especially early on when you're getting your bearings. You may as well be working within your comfort zone in terms of your power profile. The fourth tip I have for you is to sign up for Zwift Power. So I recently did a very long video that is a very comprehensive introduction to Zwift Power. It's not exhaustive, but it goes through pretty much everything you need to understand as a beginner when it comes to Zwift Power. And do those group rides and events, do those group workouts, and be signed up with Zwift Power, because what Zwift Power is going to do is it's going to pull a lot of those events and a lot of your power information. If you're riding those rides competitively and to the best of your ability, it's going to be able to build a better power profile for you. What happens with a lot of folks is they might jump onto Zwift and do a ramp test, and they might get a pretty decent FTP, but they haven't really worked their entire power profile, or maybe they just don't have the repeatability or the conditioning to race. So you might have an FTP of 300 watts, and maybe that's 3.5 watts per kilogram for you. So you jump into the Bs, and within a minute or two, you're getting completely shelled off the back. It's because you haven't built out the entire profile. Maybe that ramp test kind of suits your strengths for those shorter efforts, but you're not able to sustain that and repeat that. So maybe that is the wrong category for you. That's the problem with Zwift categorization, and that's where Zwift Power comes into play. It helps to kind of correct for that. It takes your trend data and your power curves based on actual rides where you've been in those scenarios where you're going to have to execute on that power profile, and it uses that to build the proper categorization. So the earlier on you can sign up for Zwift Power, even if you're not racing right away, let it collect some of that data in group rides, group events, and group workouts so that it can help to build you a profile so that when you do feel comfortable getting into a race, you're not over-categorized or even under-categorized. And if you're not going to use Zwift Power, there's really no harm in starting at the bottom, right? Start at a D level. There's no shame in doing that, especially if you're a beginner. Maybe you might be a little bit stronger than the Ds are capable of, but it's a good place to learn, right? You're going to be able to learn more about the dynamics. So if you think that you're between two categories and you think your power profile is landing in a certain direction, but you haven't already raced, be conservative. Go down a category. So you can evaluate that on your own, but I would highly recommend using Zwift Power. I'm not going to repeat how that entire system works here for those of you who have seen that video, but I will link that video down below. I think there's a lot of valuable information in there, and there are chapters in there, so you can kind of take what you need and leave the rest. The fifth tip I have for you is surrounding what you might have in terms of performance anxiety or some nerves. Don't think just because this is a digital platform that people don't get race nerves, especially when you're maybe looking around on Zwift Power, you're watching some YouTube videos, or you're watching some races online. You're going to realize very quickly that there's a huge breadth and depth of talent when it comes to all of the categories on Zwift, from A to D. There are people who've been doing this for a long time. They're very handy tactically and strategically, and it could be really daunting. It could shake your confidence a little bit to jump into a race. Maybe that imposter syndrome is going to rear its ugly head, and you're going to think that you don't belong there. But you can assuage a lot of these concerns by starting out with maybe some more strategic race selection. So one thing you might want to look at is not racing during those peak Zwifting hours. So for the European and the United States time zone, that's going to be your after work hours, maybe from 4 to 7 p.m. on weekdays, or those morning to early afternoon hours on weekends where most of those riders are on Zwift. That's where you're going to find the greatest depth in terms of talent and ability. If you can avoid those time zones, maybe race a little bit later or a little bit earlier, you can still ride with some talented folks, but you're not going to have that same depth in terms of competition. So you can get your feet wet in a field that might not be, 20, 30 deep of some big hitters. If riding outside of those peak hours really isn't an option for you, you can be strategic in your race selection all the same. You can look at maybe some of the less popular or newer racing series, right? There's certain racing series out there that you'll realize that are the big names that are very popular, that draw larger crowds or a more competitive crowd more often. Maybe you go to those lesser known races just to get your feet wet, right? Maybe you're going to find, people who are new to racing. There's a lot of racing for newbies out there as well. You might want to jump into one of those, but you can be strategic in your race choice. And the thing to look at when you're choosing a race is field size. So large field sizes, maybe 75, 100, more people, versus a smaller field size, which might be 15, 20, 30 people. You know, there's going to be some pros and cons for new riders for both of those, and maybe you can pick which one of those that you're ready to deal with as you're just getting started. So for a larger race, one of the benefits is that you have a huge group of people, right? So you're going to have a larger draft, you're generally going to have a larger group, you might have more of an opportunity to kind of recover within that group. If you do happen to get dropped from a group, the likelihood that there's another group behind ready to scoop you up so you can continue to at least work hard and try to finish as the best of the rest, it's going to have a lot of opportunities for you to finish that race strong and do what you got into the race to do. The downside to racing in a large group is, first of all, the large groups always start exceptionally hard because people are trying to make that initial selection. If the group is large enough, people don't want to get caught at the back, especially if they haven't slotted themselves a good starting position in the pen. So they're trying to overcome all of these riders, and the pace stays pretty high for a long time until that final selection is made, and then the group will settle in. If you're not prepared or don't have the fitness built for that, a large race might not suit you very well. So it's something that you want to consider. And I talked about the sticky draft. This is an exceptionally common occurrence in the larger races. As that group gets really strung out for the first 5, 10, 15 minutes, you might have to find yourself leapfrogging up through other riders if you're poorly positioned, and you can burn a lot of matches by trying to surge around that sticky draft to close all those little gaps people are opening up. So just bear that in mind for larger races. When it comes to smaller races, not all the time, but they often do not start as hard because you can see everybody. There's nowhere to hide. You know, surging out of the start, if you want to go solo the entire ride by yourself, you can go ahead and do that, but usually that's not a really good strategy unless you're just completely outmatching the rest of the field, right? Most people, especially if it's a race of reasonable distance, they're not looking to solo it right from the start line. So people might start a little bit hard, get up that momentum, get up to speed, make sure that, you know, any of the people that might just not be able to hack it might get dropped off the back. But as soon as that group settles in within the first minute or two, things usually calm down in those smaller groups. So if you're not prepared for that huge surge in the beginning, not exclusively, but you'll usually find that that's less of an issue when it comes to those smaller races. The downsides there is it's going to be more of a long-term challenge. So when you are in a smaller group, typically for that same speed and that skill level, you're going to have to work harder. There's less people to draw off of in terms of that draft, right? There's less of that benefit of the big blob. So your power might not be as surgy, but it's going to be higher at a steadier state with that smaller group. And if you really do get dropped off the back, there's really nowhere to go, right? If there's 15 to 20 people and you happen to get dropped off that group, you're riding it solo to the finish. And usually there's not a whole lot of impetus at that point to put out that race effort, which is what you're there for. So it may or may not suit you to be in the smaller races. Think about how you are suited, how you are prepared in terms of your racing and what you've practiced for. It might suit you to select a large race or a small race or something in between where you can kind of understand how the dynamics are going to play out. And I do have one more tip for you guys, and it's really more of a suggestion than a tip, and that's to be a student of racing, to really relish in that experience and to try to learn as you go. It's the same thing as racing outdoors. While there's things that you can intellectually understand when it comes to racing, it's really not something that you can think your way through all the time. You need to be able to practice those skills, to understand the dynamics, to kind of learn about the psychology of racing. And yes, you can do that even if you don't see other riders. You observe how they behave. Again, you use this side of the screen to see how people react to other moves when there's power spikes, what's going on. You can kind of learn how the reactions are. You'll see that sometimes a move will work on one day and then it won't work the next. You have to kind of practice rolling with the punches and understand the dynamics of racing. And that only comes from experience and paying attention to what's going on. Take some mental notes of what you're seeing. And the biggest thing I can recommend is to take risks. You're not going to get hurt racing in Zwift, right? If you take a risk in Zwift and you put out this huge amount of power, you're not going to crash. You're not going to get hurt. You're not going to die. This is the time to kind of take those risks. I have a great deal of respect for somebody who's going to take a risk, maybe try to go out on a break, blow themselves up, and finish dead last, than somebody who just rides well within their comfort zone and finishes 50th out of 100. You know, I have no problem with people who finish 50th out of 100. That's perfectly respectable. But if you're going to finish 50th, make sure that you're giving it everything you have. If you're not taking those risks and giving it everything that you have, you're kind of missing the spirit of racing in general. Nobody's going to take your test results and put them on the chalkboard for everybody in class to look at and judge you for. Nobody cares what you're doing. Unless you're in the top 5, nobody's looking at your results on Zwift Power. Nobody's judging you. This is the place to make those mistakes and to really kind of test and experiment some different approaches when it comes to racing. That is the best way to learn. Nothing I'm going to tell you is going to set you up to win or feel completely competent or confident in these races. It's going to come from using these tips, practicing the fundamentals, getting the experience both in and out of racing. And I guarantee you in short order you will build up the confidence, and then you'll completely forget why you were so nervous to get into racing to begin with. But I think racing on Zwift is really great. It can be really fun, and that is the key thing to take away from all of this. Racing should be fun. You should be having fun. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Divorce yourself from the results. There's too many confounding variables when it comes to Zwift. Yes, try to do the best you can. Don't take it as a slight against your capacity as a rider because you don't finish first. You might even finish dead last. When it comes to bike racing in general, and especially on Zwift, it is not the fastest or the strongest person that wins the race. It's the person that slows down the least. It's the person that can ride the most strategically and tactically. It's the person that has the best of luck in terms of getting power-ups that they might need for a certain type of race, and it's using those power-ups effectively. So learn from experience. Have fun while you're doing it. In fact, I recommend checking out a couple of people on YouTube who live stream your races. You can learn a lot just by watching that. But the best way you're going to learn is to experience it and have fun. So get out there and race. Have fun. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them down below. If you got any value out of this video, if you wouldn't mind hitting the thumbs up button, I'd very much appreciate it. Give you a couple more Zwift videos over here. Subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, I will catch you in the next one. See ya.